Hey, hello everyone! As you've probably seen from the past two videos I uploaded, I am still obsessed with the Plague Tale series, and this video is further proof of that. But this video is going to be a different kind of theory video, because today we are going to talk about the potential scenarios for a third Plague Tale game. Now before we start, I need to make a few things crystal clear. Number 1, a third game has not been announced. Number 2, everything I talk about in this video is pure speculation based on what we know from Innocence and Requiem. Number 3, I am not saying that Asobo Studios needs to commit to any of these ideas or even make a third game at all. I am merely presenting ideas as a fan of the product. And number 4, obviously, spoilers for Innocence and Requiem ahead. With all that out of the way, let's get started. Before we truly dive into the idea of what could happen in a third game, we need to know what happened in the other two, so let's talk about that for a second. In Innocence, we are introduced to a large variety of important and recurring characters, including Amicia, Hugo, Beatrice, and Lucas. We are also introduced to the concept of the prima macula, the ancient disease that runs in the blood of the de Rune family, and which currently afflicts young Hugo. After facing off against the Inquisition and staring death in the face about a bajillion times, Amicia and Hugo, with the help of their friends, are able to overcome and defeat Lord Nicholas and Grand Inquisitor Vitalis Benevent and bring the Inquisition to an end. 3 days later, the crew departs to the Red City. 6 months later, Requiem begins and shit goes wrong fast. After half a year with 0 issues, the prima macula has reawoken within Hugo, this time worse than ever. At this point, Hugo has crossed 2 of the 3 thresholds of the prima macula and is coming dangerously close to crossing the final one, which would result in his death. Throughout all of this, Hugo has a recurring dream about an island, a phoenix, and magical healing water that could cure him, and he repeatedly relays this information to the crew, of which only Amicia seems to believe him. Magister Vaudan, a doctor from the Order, declares Hugo condemned, and orders that he be locked away in Marseille. On the way, however, they are ambushed, and the siblings get separated from Beatrice and Lucas. After meeting up with some new companions, Amicia and Hugo finally arrive at the aforementioned island, Lacuna. To put an extremely long story short, this island is not what it seems. The dream was pure deception on behalf of the prima macula, and it directly resulted in Beatrice's death, as well as Hugo getting captured by the Count of Provence after he witnessed Amicia getting shot. Believing his sister to be dead, Hugo gives himself to the macula and completely obliterates Marseille. After making their way to Marseille, Amicia and Lucas journey into the Nebula in a desperate final attempt to reach Hugo. After what I can only describe as the weirdest hallucination I've ever witnessed, Amicia comes to the realization that the only way to stop the plague now is if Hugo dies. And as much as it pained her to do so, she was able to will herself to end her little brother's suffering and stop the plague for good. In the epilogue, Amicia and Sophia set out to search for signs of the next carrier, but not before she pays her respect at Hugo's memorial at the mountain's summit. Whew, that was longer than I thought it would be. But now that we have that context, let's start theorizing what could happen in a third game. The biggest problem that I see for a potential third game is that Hugo is seemingly dead. And I say seemingly for one reason. Well, 2 actually. If you've been a part of the Plague Tale community for a decent amount of time, there's a good chance you've probably heard about the illusion theory and the phoenix theory. I've already made 2 separate videos about these theories where I dive into greater detail, so I'll link those in the description if you want to learn more. The basic idea behind these theories is that Hugo didn't really die in the nebula, because everything that happened was an illusion created by the macula itself. This idea, combined with the constant phoenix symbolism throughout both games, has led some, myself included, to believe that the ending of Requiem was another deceptive ploy by the Prima Macula, and that Hugo is not actually dead. So what does this mean as a plot for a third game? Well, for starters, Hugo would be alive, though in what condition, I'm not sure. It would be safe to assume that he would be more corrupted by the Prima Macula than he had ever been before, possibly to the point where he has little to no humanity left within himself. This could lead to an interesting angle to make Hugo the primary antagonist of the game, and would lead to Amicia having to either kill him for good this time, or search for a proper cure to save him. Now I can hear you type in your comments already, there's no cure for the macula, blah blah blah, but the reality is, we don't know that. In fact, we know next to nothing about the Prima Macula in general. All we know is that it dates back to the dawn of time, it usually manifests within children every few centuries, and it gives the carrier the ability to control the plague rats. And I haven't even mentioned another important character yet. Lucas. Because in the epilogue of Requiem, Amicia states that Lucas is on the road studying. The question is, studying what? Given his character and how he acted in both games, it would be safe to assume that he's studying the Prima Macula, or at least attempting to. And this is where the door is wide open for Asobo Studios. Given how little we actually know about the macula, this would be a golden opportunity for Asobo to create some incredible and compelling story beats for the series involving one of, if not the, most important story element in the entire series. They can easily subvert any expectations that we the fans have simply due to our limited knowledge on the Prima Macula. And one of those expectations that I could easily see being subverted is the fate of our dear Hugo de Rune. There is the chance, however, that Asobo could take the more realistic option, one where Hugo remains dead and the mission remains the same. Now don't get me wrong, I want to see Hugo in a third game just as much as the next guy. But I'm also a realist, and have prepared myself accordingly in the event he does not return in a physical form. Now that doesn't mean he won't show up at all. Given everything Amicia has gone through over the past 2 games, I feel justified in saying that she is well overdue for a psychotic break. And symptoms for this include delusional thoughts and beliefs, auditory and visual hallucinations, and paranoia. Meaning that Hugo could show up in this scenario, but it wouldn't really be him, it would be a hallucination. Now aside from all of that, what about the rest of the plot? Well, it's quite simple. Amicia, Sophia, and presumably Lucas are out searching for signs of the next carrier in order to stop the next major plague from happening. Now, as I've mentioned ad nauseum already, and will probably continue to mention throughout this video, we don't know a lot about the macula. So Lucas's studies that I mentioned earlier could reveal damn near anything to us, which could include information on how we find the next carrier. And I say next carrier very cautiously. Throughout our time playing Innocence and Requiem, we know of only 2 natural carriers of the Prima Macula, Basilius and Hugo. I'm not counting Vitalis because he had Hugo's blood injected into him, thus he is not a natural carrier. But we also have to remember that this is medieval France in the mid-1300s. History was not well documented in these times, and much of the world was not properly mapped either. So for all we know, there could be multiple carriers in other countries. But on a more serious note, given the chaotic nature of the Plague Tale games, I do not foresee everyone making it out alive. I can easily see both Sophia and Lucas dying throughout the course of this hypothetical game, and if Asobo can kill off one of the 2 primary protagonists of the series, they can easily find a way to kill off 2 side characters, as they've done in the past with Arthur, Roderick, and Arno. Obviously, this would cause Amicia's mental status to plummet, possibly to the point where, by the time the game ends, the grief would be too overwhelming, and she would take her own life. Everyone she had ever cared for, her parents, her best friends, even her little brother, all dead. She would have no reason to live anymore. She's already rattled enough as it is. And I feel like if Sophia and Lucas, the only 2 people keeping her sane right now, were to die, it would be too much, and she wouldn't be able to keep going any longer. At least then, she would finally be reunited with her family, up there. Oof, that got dark. Sorry about that. Shifting gears now, let's talk about a different set of characters, Basilius and Aelia. I've heard this idea thrown around a lot in the Plague Tale community about having the 3rd game revolve around the story of Basilius and Aelia and getting to experience everything that happened through their eyes in a sort of prequel. And while yes, it is an interesting idea, I personally don't think it would work well as a 3rd game. And that's simply because we already know how their story ends. We know that Basilius and Aelia lived on Lacuna. We know that Basilius was the prior carrier of the Prima Macula and that Aelia was his protector. We know that the Order was studying Basilius and the Macula. We know that the Order locked Basilius deep underground to mitigate the damage he could cause. We know that Aelia fought like hell to reach him before eventually succumbing to the numbers of the Order's warriors. And we know that as soon as Basilius knew Aelia was dead, he gave himself to the Macula and unleashed the Justinian Plague. So for that reason, I feel that fully devoting any and all time and energy towards a 3rd game where we already know the outcome would not be the best course of action. But that doesn't mean the idea is off the table entirely. I could easily see this scenario being put together as a sort of mini-story for some sort of DLC for Requiem. Now, as for how exactly Asobo would go about doing this is another question entirely. But we also have to think about the lore implications of this as well. Because if this scenario is able to give us more exposition on the Order and, more importantly, the Phoenix, then that opens a lot of other doors for the rest of the series. Finally, let's talk about what is probably the least appealing idea in this list. Modern day. I'm gonna come out and say it right now. I do not think a modern day Plague Tale game would be a good idea, and neither does most of the community for that matter. But it is an idea and is within the realm of possibility, so let's talk about it. The final cutscene in Requiem shows a baby in a hospital with what sounds like a ventilator in the background and the macula's mark on its arm. So let's talk ventilators then. The first ventilators appeared in the early 1800s, and the ones we typically see in hospital ICUs today didn't appear until the 1940s. So that gives us a relatively large time frame, about a century and a half. After doing some research, and by that I mean reading one Wikipedia article, I found that there were a few worldwide plagues in this time frame, including the Spanish flu, the Russia typhus epidemic, the cholera pandemic, and the flu pandemic. But just because modern-day ventilators were invented in the early 1940s, that doesn't mean the plague has to take place before that time. There's also the Hong Kong flu, the influenza pandemic, the third plague pandemic, the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and of course the COVID-19 pandemic. If we do go down the modern day route for the third Plague Tale game, any of these plagues would be viable contenders for the overarching threat that we must avoid. However, it does call into question how would the plague be physically represented. In Innocence and Requiem, the Black Plague was represented by the millions upon millions of rats swarming all of Europe, simply because in real life, rats brought fleas, and those fleas carried the plague with them. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm not exactly seeing swarms of rats outside my apartment. Not to mention, if we do get a modern day setting, that takes away almost everything about the Plague Tale series as we know it. We've spent 4 years and 2 games in medieval France creating emotional connections to characters like Amicia, Hugo, and Lucas. A modern day setting would take away both of those things, putting us in a more civilized land and introducing us to new characters that we suddenly have to care about just because they're going through the same thing that the original crew did centuries beforehand. And aside from all of that, Asobo themselves have come out and claimed that the post-credits cutscene was more symbolic than anything. I said it at the top of this paragraph, I do not think a modern-day setting would work, and I'm going to stand by that statement. If you disagree, that's fine. More power to you. Everyone has their own opinion, and this is mine. Now, as far as I'm aware, those are all the potential scenarios that we could see play out in a third game. But that's not the end of the video, because there are some more slightly obscure things I want to talk about that don't relate to the plot of a third game, but rather hint towards the idea in general of a third game. Let's start with hints from Asobo directly. Asobo has said in the past that they do not have any immediate plans for a Plague Tale game after Requiem. But what's interesting is that in an Instagram Q&A shortly after Innocence released, they said the exact same thing. Not only that, but game director Kevin Choteau, I hope I'm saying that right, did an interview with PlayStation.blog that dropped the day before Requiem released. And when asked if Requiem was truly the end for the Plague Tale series, Choteau said, quote, "I think for now it's the end. But the door is never closed, and we'll see the player reception. We want to see their reaction before deciding anything. They are driving our production, and if they don't like what we've done, we need to do something else," end quote. And considering it took less than 1 month for Requiem to sell over 1 million copies worldwide, I think it's safe to say that player reception was pretty positive. There are, of course, other interviews that were conducted with members from the Asobo team that briefly allude to the idea of a third game, and I'll link those in the description if you want to read the full things. For now, though, there's one more thing I want to talk about in this section regarding hints from Asobo directly. At this year's Pegasus Awards, A Plague Tale Requiem was nominated for several awards and even won a few. At one point, the game director was speaking about Requiem and said this: "I can't speak French, so I'm not even gonna try, but the English translation roughly says, 'Tomorrow at the studio, we will have to roll up our sleeves and prepare the sequel as dignified as possible.'" Now granted, this translation could be incorrect. But if it's not, it's interesting that the word sequel is used here, especially since he was talking about Requiem when he said this. Again, this could have just been a bad translation, or it could have been a hardcore slip that inadvertently confirmed a third Plague Tale game. Moving on, we're going to look at a piece of promotional artwork that was shown off by Asobo Studios on social media shortly before Innocence released. In this image, we see a ship bearing the Order logo, along with 3 words on the right side: Care, Rise, Defy. Let's talk about the ship first, because despite this image being posted a few weeks before Innocence released, we never see any ships throughout the entirety of Innocence. Only during the final cutscene of the game do we even get a glimpse at any ships, and these are way too far away to make any distinctions. And the other thing of note regarding the ship is obviously the Order logo. Although it was hinted to us several times throughout Innocence, we never hear about the Order by name until Requiem, so it's interesting to me that the concept of the Order was teased as far back as April of 2019. And although we do finally see a ship in Requiem in the form of La Rascas, Sophia's boat, she is clearly not affiliated with the Order in any way. So it begs the question, whose boat is this? That's a question for another day, but for now, let's talk about the three words: care, rise, defy. Seeing as this image was used as promotional artwork for Innocence, it would be safe to assume that these words were used as, for lack of a better term, hype to, well, promote the game, which admittedly makes perfect sense. Amicia is learning to care for Hugo, they're actively rising against any and all opposition, as well as outwardly defying the Inquisition. But I would like to pose to you an idea that's been discussed in the Focus Entertainment Discord server over the past few months. The idea is that each individual word is representative of a fully fledged game in the series. Meaning, the first word, care, would represent Innocence, the second, rise, would be for Requiem, and defy, well, we don't know yet. The meaning of care is obvious for Innocence, as I mentioned earlier, having Amicia care for Hugo. Rise for Requiem is a bit harder to place, considering how the game ended up playing out. It could mean the rise of a climax, it could symbolize Hugo passing the final threshold of the Prima Macula, or it could mean something else entirely, we just don't know. But that brings us to the third word, defy. If we do get a third game, and this idea that I'm speaking of pans out, what would the word defy imply? To me, it could imply two things. One, the macula itself defying being quote-unquote defeated by Amicia at the end of Requiem, or two, the illusion and Phoenix theories coming to fruition and Hugo not being truly dead, thus defying all expectations. But regardless of what this poster actually means, only Asobo knows for certain, and I don't imagine they would be giving away their secrets that easily. Finally, let's talk about an interesting comparison that could allude to bigger things on the horizon. I've been seeing a few people in the Focus Entertainment Discord server comparing Hugo's story to that of Jesus Christ, specifically the Christian adaptation as the Son of God. I'm gonna put this out there right now, I'm agnostic, and I don't know shit about religion, so my apologies if anything I say is incorrect, please don't smite me. The basic idea of Jesus' story is that he lived a life without sin on behalf of humanity and died for our sins so that we would not suffer. Oddly similar to how Hugo's story ended in Requiem, dying on the nucleus so that the rats would go away, thus the citizens would not suffer the plague any longer. One member in the server cited a specific verse in reference to Jesus Christ's death. Galatians 3:13 states, quote, "Christ redeemed us from the curse of law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, 'Cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree,'" end quote. Now let's do a little checklist in comparing Hugo to Jesus, shall we? Curse? Check, the Prima Macula. Suffering? Check, the physical and mental anguish experienced by the young boy throughout both games. Death? Check. Countless lives were lost throughout both games. Hanged on a tree? Check. Hugo is bound to the nucleus, which is basically a giant tree, and if you look closer, you can see that Hugo is even crucified, the same position that Jesus died in. Sacrifice? Check. Hugo told Amicia to kill him so that the world could live on without him. Now the interesting part. Resurrection. 3 days after his death, Jesus Christ rose from the grave. Now if this comparison between the two is by design, one can reasonably assume that the resurrection part would come next for Hugo. But I guess we'll have to wait and see. But for now, that will be the end of the video. If you guys enjoyed and found this video interesting, make sure to leave a like and let me know what you think. Will we get a third Plague Tale game? And if so, what do you think the story will be? Anyways, that's all from me for now. Goodbye, and good night.